Okay, for our next section, we want to continue to learn about recording macros. There was one thing I forgot to do in the previous video, and that's to show you yet another way to execute a macro is by adding a button. So I want to go back to the inventory spreadsheet and add the button. So we add a form button by clicking Developer, Insert, and selecting the icon. So one way to run the macro is by clicking on macros and then selecting run. Once we select the macro, we only have one. Another way is the shortcut that we created, which was Control I. A third way to do it is to create a button. And in the developer menu, there's this little toolbox here called Insert. Not to be confused with this insert on the main ribbon. But under the developer menu, this first option here is called a button. So I'm going to click on the button. So I just click once on it, and then when I go out to my spreadsheet, I can drag and move the shape to size it. And when I release my mouse button, I get a pop-up, and it asks me what macro do I want to run when the button's clicked. So I'm going to click on Compute Inventory and then click OK. And it's going to name the button Button 1. I usually like to put descriptive text in it, so I'm going to click on where the B appears, and I'm going to hit the delete button on my keyboard to get rid of Button 1, and I'll put Compute Inventory as the text. And then I click away to get out of edit mode. And let me just delete a little bit of data here. And I will clear the conditional format. And when I click Compute Inventory, it should execute everything we had recorded in the last macro. So the button seems to work just fine. So let's move on to the next step. And this one is a little bit more complicated. I don't want to get hung up in the kind of the minutia of doing the calculations. So in the instructions, I have some formulas for regular pay, overtime pay, and total pay. So if hours worked is less than 40, then they don't get any overtime. They just get the regular pay, which is hours worked times 40. If they didn't work any overtime, if they didn't work more than 40 hours, their regular pay is just the number of hours that they worked. Their overtime pay is if they work more than 40 hours, they get paid time and a half. And then their total pay, otherwise they get zero overtime. The total pay is the regular pay plus overtime pay. So let's practice that. So I would put some headings out here. And I would create an if statement if the hours worked for the first one is greater than 40, then the regular pay is only up to 40 hours. We're accounting for the extra hours worked in the OT pay. So if they worked more than 40 hours, we're multiplying 40 times the hourly rate. If they worked less than 40 hours, they get their hours worked times their pay rate. So again, I understand that some of you may not understand that, but I don't want to get caught up in the details of computing regular pay and overtime pay and putting that in an Excel function, so you can just copy what I have if it's confusing to you. So now with our overtime pay, and I could autofill this to complete it. And I can test to make sure that somebody who works 44 hours is only getting paid for 40 for their regular pay. So it's 40 times 15, which is 600. If they worked less than 40 hours, so this person worked 30 hours, but they're making 20 an hour, so they're also getting 600 for their regular pay, but they're not getting paid for all 40 hours, obviously, if they only work 30. Okay, so OT pay, I'm going to start off the same, if statement, if hours worked is greater than 40, then we want to count how many overtime hours they worked. So 40 minus, or hours worked minus 40, how much overtime do they work? So this one will be 6 hours times the hourly rate times 1.5 for time and a half. If they did not work overtime, then their overtime pay is 0. So the math is a little bit easier on the second employee here. So they worked 4 hours of overtime. 4 times 15 is 60, but they get paid time and a half, so it's 90. This employee here did not work overtime, so they get 0. And the total pay is just the regular pay plus the overtime pay. And we would want to do a little bit of formatting. Bold. And define these as currency. Okay, so that's what we want the macro to do, is to automatically fill this in. So let's say that each week they're getting a new timesheet in that has the employee names with the hourly rate and the hours worked, and we want them to be able to click the payroll at the click of a button rather than having to redo all these steps every single week. So let's delete these columns and record a macro to do this. So I'm going to go to the developer menu and I'm going to select record macro. And I'm going to call this compute pay. And I'm going to put no spaces between compute and pay. Compute is like a keyword, so you can't have a macro with the word compute if it has a space in it. Control P will be our shortcut, and I'll click OK. And now I'm recording. I was careful not to leave my mouse up in D1, so I'm going to move my active cell to D1 as part of the recording. And I'm going to start by putting my headings in. Regular pay, OT pay, and total pay. The regular pay is going to be if hours worked is greater than 40, then 40 times the pay rate. Otherwise, it's going to be the hours worked times the pay rate. After I get the first one entered, I'm going to double click to autofill, and then I'm going to move to E2. Another if statement. If hours worked is greater than 40, if that's true, I want to subtract 40 from the hours worked to just compute the amount of overtime that they worked, and multiply that by their hourly rate and pay them times 1.5. If they did not work overtime, then they don't get paid for overtime pay, so I put a 0 in. Put in my parentheses to finish the if statement, hit enter, move back up and double click to autofill, and I'll have a total pay equal to regular pay plus overtime pay. Double click to autofill. I'm going to select the columns as currency format. I'm going to bold the headings and put in a bottom border, and I'm going to click each of the 3 columns and autofit to size them, and then I'll go back to developer and stop the recording. So now to test it, I'm going to click undo a bunch of times, until they disappear, and then I'll hit Control P and it magically reappears. I can delete these cells, and let me add a button here. So I'm going to insert a form button. This time I have 2 options. I'm going to click Control Compute Pay, and I'm going to modify the button text by clicking in there, then hitting the delete. Click away, and I'll click on it and hope it runs. If you have an error here, you might want to test it multiple times with your active cell in different places. If you have an error here, you may not have moved to D1 as part of your first step. So anyway, that is a second example for you to draw on for recording a macro.